All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive, into media coverage from 2018.
Okay.
And we're going to be looking at it through the lens of this YouTube video.
Right.
It's called Breaking. These are the 18 most mortifying media moments of 2018. They want you to forget. .mp3.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so what is this video all about?
Well, it features this commentator named Gary Franchi.
Okay.
And he's from this outlet called Next News Network.
Aye.
And he basically goes through this list of what he calls these mortifying moments
Okay.
from media coverage in 2018.
So he's kind of framing this as a critique then of how the mainstream media was covering things.
Yeah, and he seems to be particularly focused on like how President Trump was covered and then also the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Right, that was a big one.
Huge, yeah.
So like, what are some of the specific examples that he pulls out as these mortifying moments?
Well, he starts off by going after this social media influencer named Bento Aor.
Okay, I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, and I wasn't either. But he basically calls him out for making people horny on Instagram.
Okay, so he's starting off with kind of a moral judgment there.
Yeah, and he's also sort of bringing social media influencers into the mix.
Right, because they're increasingly becoming part of that whole media ecosystem.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
And then he moves on to the Olympics.
Okay.
And he takes aim at all the coverage of the North Korean cheerleading squad.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and he's kind of suggesting...
Like it was this big spectacle.
Exactly, and he's suggesting that the media was basically being played.
Ah, okay.
By North Korea's propaganda machine.
Interesting.
Yeah, so he's kind of saying, like, by focusing on these cheerleaders, they were distracting from, the more serious issues.
Right, the human rights abuses and all that.
Exactly.
Okay, so he's starting to build a case here.
Yeah, and then he really goes after CNN.
Okay.
He accuses them of, like, dumpster diving in Russia. Yeah, and then also interviewing a self-proclaimed sex coach in Thailand.
Oh, wow.
And it was all, like, in search of dirt on Trump.
So he's saying they were going to extreme lengths to try to dig up something.
Yeah, and he even says that they're loosening the usual boundaries governing journalism.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, I think he's really trying to imply that they were crossing ethical lines.
Right, to damage Trump.
Exactly.
Oh, interesting.
And then there's this whole segment where he focuses on the word bombshell.
Okay.
And he shows all these clips of, like, news anchors using that word to describe allegations against Trump.
Interesting. So, like, what do you think he's trying to do there?
Well, when you say the word bombshell, it, like, creates this sense of shock, right? It implies that something is, like, really explosive.
Yeah.
And so I think he's trying to say that the media was intentionally using that word
to sensationalize things?
Exactly, to make even, like, minor allegations seem like they're a huge deal.
Right, to try to make Trump look bad.
And then he also includes a lot of examples of, like, profanity and strong language that was used on news programs.
Right.
And he presents it as, like, evidence of declining journalistic standards.
That's interesting because, like, what he might see as unprofessional, others might just see as, like, a more casual approach.
Yeah, right.
And that's kind of a trend we've seen across all media, not just news.
Totally.
Okay.
And then, of course, he gets into the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Right. That was huge.
Yeah, and he's particularly focused on the allegations of sexual misconduct against Kavanaugh. And he seems to be criticizing outlets that he felt were too quick to believe the allegations.
So he's framing this as an example of media bias against conservatives.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
And then he includes some pretty extreme examples.
Like what?
Like clips of people comparing Trump to Nazi Germany.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and calling him evil.
Yeah, that's pretty inflammatory rhetoric.
It is, and I think that's exactly what Franchi's trying to point out.
Right, that kind of language really just ramps up the division. That doesn't help anything.
And then he also highlights a bunch of times where commentators say that Trump voters are racist.
Ooh, okay.
And he calls this like a really bad example of media bias.
Right, because it's like painting a whole group of people with one brush.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this whole collection of moments that Franchi's has pulled out.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that he chose these very specifically.
Right, this is all curated.
To support his overall argument.
He's telling a very specific story with these examples.
Exactly.
Okay, this is fascinating.
So we've seen all these moments that Franchi is calling out.
Yeah.
But what's his, like, overall takeaway?
Yeah, like how does he tie this all together?
Well, in his commentary, he really goes after the mainstream media.
Okay.
Like, he calls them Democrat cheerleaders.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he accuses them of being obsessed with impeaching Trump.
So he's really leaning into this partisan angle.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But that's not uncommon, right?
Yeah, especially for commentators like him who see themselves as outside the mainstream.
right? They
Right.
often use that kind of like us versus them rhetoric,
Yeah, and it can be really effective.
especially with humor and sarcasm.
Right. It makes it more entertaining and memorable.
Definitely. And it also helps him position himself as like the truth teller.
Yeah, like he's the only one brave enough to speak out against the powerful media.
Exactly.
And he really plays up this idea that the media is like hiding the truth from people.
Okay.
He even tells viewers to subscribe to a backup channel.
A backup channel.
Yeah, he claims that Next News Network is in grave danger.
Oh, wow. So he's creating a sense of urgency,
Totally.
like they're under attack, which can be a really powerful way to build loyalty.
It's like he's creating his own echo chamber.
Right, where people only hear information that confirms their existing beliefs.
Exactly. And it's hard to break out of that cycle.
It really is, especially with social media algorithms and everything.
Right, they just keep feeding you more of what you already agree with.
Yeah, it's like a filter bubble.
So it seems like Franchi is benefiting from that dynamic too.
In a way.
Yeah. Like he's attracting an audience that already distrusts the mainstream media.
And his content is just reinforcing those beliefs.
So then what about the people who watch this and don't already agree with him?
That's a good question.
Like, how do you think they might react?
It probably depends on their own media literacy
Yeah.
and like critical thinking skills.
Right, because if they understand how media narratives are constructed.
They might be more likely to see through his framing.
But what about people who aren't as media savvy?
Yeah, I mean, they could definitely be persuaded by his arguments.
Especially because he uses humor.
Yeah, and
So
sarcasm.
it's not as, like, in your face.
Right, it can be more subtle.
So what can we do about it?
Like, how can we become more critical consumers of information?
Especially when we're constantly bombarded with so much of it.
Well, I think the first step is recognizing that we all have biases.
Okay.
We all come to the table with our own preconceived notions,
So how do we, like, break free from those biases?
or at least become more aware of them. It's about actively seeking out diverse viewpoints,
Okay.
even viewpoints that we disagree with.
Oh, so it's not just about finding sources we agree with.
No, it's about getting a full picture.
Like a balanced meal.
Exactly. You don't just eat one type of food.
So you're saying we should consume information from a variety of sources?
Yeah, to get a more well-rounded perspective.
What? How do we even know where to start?
Like, how do we find reliable sources? Well, look for sources that are transparent about their funding
Okay.
and ownership.
Mm,
Check if they have a clear editorial process
yeah.
and fact-checking procedures.
That makes sense.
And be wary of sources that use a lot of emotional language.
Right. Or clickbait headlines.
Exactly.
I think this deep dive has really shown me how important it is to take a step back
Yeah.
and not just get swept up in the outrage of the moment.
Especially when it comes to politics.
Right. We need to critically evaluate the information we're consuming.
Absolutely. And that means engaging with it actively,
Oh.
not passively.
So what does that look like?
Ask questions, consider different perspectives, and don't be afraid to change your mind.
If you're presented with new evidence,
Right.
we spent some time with Gary Franchi's perspective.
Yeah. His take on 2018.
But you know, this whole deep dive was really curated just for you.
Right, for our listeners?
So what are your takeaways?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting how he used these specific examples
Mm-hmm.
to create this bigger narrative.
Yeah, about media bias.
And how he thinks the media is manipulating people.
Yeah, and it definitely seemed like he was trying to appeal to a particular audience.
Yeah, with a very specific viewpoint.
It makes you wonder, like, what would your most mortifying media moments list look like?
That's a great question.
Like, how do you even decide who to trust these days?
Right, there's so much information out there.
It's overwhelming.
It really is.
Yeah.
But I think one key is to diversify your media diet.
Okay, what does that mean?
Don't rely on just one source for your news.
Okay.
Explore different perspectives,
Even ones you disagree with.
especially ones you disagree with.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because that can help you get a more balanced understanding of things.
So it's not just about finding sources that confirm what you already believe
Right. It's about challenging your own assumptions.
and getting the full picture.
Exactly.
But how do you even know where to start?
With so many sources out there.
Yeah, like how do you find ones that are actually reliable?
Well, look for sources that are transparent about their funding
Okay.
and who owns them.
Mm-hmm.
See if they have a clear editorial process.
Yeah,
And if they fact check their information.
that makes sense.
And be wary of sources that use a lot of emotional language.
Oh, yeah. Or those clickbait headlines.
Exactly.
I think this deep dive has really made me realize how easy it is to get caught up in the outrage,
Yeah.
especially with politics.
It can be really tempting to just go along with whatever confirms our biases.
So you're saying we need to be more critical
Absolutely.
of the information we're consuming?
I can't just take everything at face value.
Well, I think we've learned a lot today
Me too.
about Gary Franchi's perspective
And about the media landscape in general,
and how to be more critical consumers of information.
which is so important these days.
It really is. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.